He slid the divorce papers across the desk like she was a business transaction. He was finally closing. 6 years. 6 years of rising before dawn, covering his debts with her own money, saving his estate from men who were robbing him blind. And Jonathan Mercer thanked her by arranging the library like a courtroom and placing another woman beside him in the room. He expected her to cry. He expected her to sign. Instead, Elizabeth Whitmore sat a leather ledger on top of those papers, looked her husband dead in the eyes, and said 3 words that stripped every certainty from the room. If you have ever held everything together while someone looked right through you, you need to hear what she said next. Subscribe, and don't you dare leave. The silver tray was waiting for Elizabeth before she even reached the library door. She heard it first, the particular sound of Thomas setting something on polished wood, careful and precise, the way a senior footman moves when he has been instructed that the moment matters. She had been walking down the east corridor toward the library to retrieve her morning correspondence, and she stopped in the hallway outside and listened, because Elizabeth Whitmore had learned long ago that the sounds a house makes tell you more truth than the words spoken inside it. Then she heard a second voice. Not Thomas. A woman's voice, low and carefully modulated, the kind of voice that has been trained to project composure in rooms where composure is a performance. Charlotte Ashford. Elizabeth placed her hand on the library door and pushed it open. She took in the room in one steady sweep, the fire burning though the morning was not cold enough to require it. The curtains drawn to the halfway point. The divorce papers centered on the desk beside an uncapped pen. Jonathan standing to the left of the desk with the particular practiced ease of a man who has rehearsed a scene and is satisfied with the arrangement. And Charlotte Ashford standing 3 feet to his right, wearing the blue silk gown. The blue silk gown. The one Jonathan had told Elizabeth 2 Christmases past was too expensive to justify purchasing for herself. Elizabeth did not move immediately. She stood in the doorway and let the room settle into her, understanding every detail of it, because details had always mattered to her in a way they had never mattered to Jonathan, and because this particular collection of details was telling her something clear and complete. This had been planned, not decided in a moment of feeling. Planned. The fire, the pen, the placement of Charlotte's body in the room slightly behind Jonathan, slightly to the side, close enough to signal alliance, far enough to avoid the appearance of accusation. Jonathan looked at her with the confidence of a man who believes the outcome is already settled. Elizabeth. His voice was measured and gentle, in the way that people are gentle when they have decided something and believe that gentleness will smooth the passage. This marriage has reached its end. Charlotte lowered her eyes with the practiced delicacy of a woman performing regret she has been coached through. Elizabeth walked into the room. She did not hurry. She moved toward the desk at her normal pace, the unhurried pace of a woman who has walked this house for 6 years and owned every step of it, and she looked at the divorce papers with the same focused attention she brought to every document that crossed her desk, reading the opening clauses, noting the legal language, assessing the terms. The pen sat uncapped beside the papers. The whole arrangement was designed for efficiency. Sign here, and this is done. Jonathan watched her face for the moment. It broke. It did not break. Elizabeth looked up from the papers, and she smiled. Not a large smile, not a performance. The small, specific smile of a woman who has already survived the worst thing and recognizes in the current moment that she is being tested by something considerably smaller. Jonathan's confidence shifted. Why are you smiling? Because you built this room for a woman who doesn't exist, Elizabeth said. You expected someone who would cry, someone who would beg, someone who would reach for that pen because she believed she had no other choice. Elizabeth, I am not that woman. She turned from the desk and walked to the small cabinet against the east wall. I have never been that woman. You simply did not know who I was. She opened the cabinet. She withdrew a leather ledger, her own maintained in her own hand, updated every week for 6 years without exception. She carried it back to the desk and set it beside the divorce papers with deliberate care. Jonathan looked at the ledger. What is that? Your estate, Elizabeth said. The accurate version. Charlotte Ashford looked up. Jonathan's voice sharpened slightly at the edges. My solicitor maintains the estate records. Your solicitor maintains the version of the estate records he wishes you to see. Elizabeth opened the ledger to the first marked page. The Mercer estate currently carries $28,000 in concealed debt. I have documented the source of every dollar. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one that had existed before. Charlotte straightened almost imperceptibly. Jonathan's jaw tightened. That's not... The northern fields have been losing yield for 3 consecutive seasons. Elizabeth turned to this next page. Not from weather, from a crop rotation pattern that has not been updated in a decade. I had a consulting farmer assess the situation in the summer of 1811 and implement corrections. The north yield has recovered. You attributed it to favorable weather. A pause. The worker wage account has been shorted 6 times since last spring. Another page. On 3 of those occasions, I covered the shortfall from my personal household account, so the payments could be made on time. The workers believed the estate paid them correctly. It did not. Jonathan stared at the ledger. Charlotte turned her head toward him. Jonathan. He did not answer her. And the mill contract? Elizabeth continued, her voice steady and unhurried, as a woman reading the minutes of a meeting she has chaired many times, which you credited to a favorable market when Thomas Greer renewed in February of 1813. That renewal occurred because I corresponded with Greer for 4 months and restructured the fee arrangement to protect the estate's position. He had been preparing to move the business to the Reynolds operation in Staunton. The fire popped. Nobody moved. Charlotte Ashford spoke again, and this time her voice had lost the practiced composure. What is she talking about? Jonathan Mercer had no answer, and that particular silence from a man who had walked into this room 60 seconds ago with the settled confidence of someone who believed this was already finished was the thing that changed everything. Elizabeth closed the ledger. If these divorce papers are signed, she said, the land agreements I hold through my father's estate revert to my name. Personally. Under the terms of my father's will, which your solicitor was informed of prior to our marriage. Jonathan looked at her with the expression of a man who is recalculating. What land agreements? The Whitmore acreage bordering the south pasture, the timber rights on the hill property. She met his eyes directly. And the grain access corridor along the Whitmore boundary. The route every farming tenant on the north side of this estate uses to move product to market. Without that corridor, they cannot get their crops out. Without their crops, the estate loses its tenant lease income. Without that income, this property cannot service its existing debts before the end of next year. Charlotte sat down. Not a graceful settling into a chair. A sudden, unplanned descent, the kind that happens when a person's body processes information before their composure catches up. Jonathan looked at the divorce papers, then at the ledger, then at Elizabeth. You're threatening me. I am informing you. Her voice did not rise, did not harden. It remained exactly what it had been from the moment she entered the room, clear, specific, and completely without performance. A threat implies I want something from you that I don't already have. I don't need anything from you, Jonathan. I am telling you the facts of your own estate so that you understand what you are choosing when you ask me to sign those papers. Jonathan's hand moved toward the ledger and then stopped. Why are you telling me? His voice had changed. The polish had come off it. If what you're saying is accurate, you could simply sign and walk away with the land. You'd have everything. Because 23 families work this land. Elizabeth looked at him without flinching. They have planted on the strength of contracts I negotiated. They have children who go to school on this property. They have debts of their own that they carry because they believe this estate was stable. I am not willing to let them absorb the consequences of a decision you made without understanding what you were deciding. Jonathan walked to the window. He stood with his back to both women, and Elizabeth watched the line of his shoulders and understood something she had not fully articulated to herself. Before this moment, he had not come into this room as a cruel man. He had come into this room as an inattentive one. Those were not the same thing, and the distinction mattered because cruelty cannot be corrected by information and inattention sometimes can. Charlotte's voice came from across the room, quieter now. Jonathan, How much of what she's saying is accurate? I don't know. The honesty of that answer was more damaging than any argument could have been. Charlotte Ashford had been offered a future by a man who had not understood his own present. You told me the estate was stable, Charlotte said carefully. You told me the marriage was, you said it was a formality at this point, that she would sign without difficulty. Charlotte. You told me you had spoken with your solicitor and everything was in order. I believe that. Was it true? Jonathan did not answer immediately. Elizabeth did not help him. She stood beside the desk with the ledger open and let the silence hold, because some silences need to be held until the people inside them arrive at their own honest understanding. Jonathan turned from the window. He looked at Elizabeth with an expression she had not seen from him before. Not the dismissive glance of a man moving past a woman he has categorized and set aside, but the actual fully present attention of someone who is seeing something for the first time and trying to understand what they are looking at. The northern fields, he said slowly. The consulting farmer. Did you? Samuel Bright, Albemarle County. I retained him in the summer of 1811 at $60 for the assessment. Elizabeth's voice was even. The revised rotation he recommended required an adjusted seed purchase of $40 the first year. I authorized both from the household discretionary account while you were in London. Jonathan absorbed that. You spent $100 on the North Fields without telling me. I sent the summary in the April packet. You returned a note through Thomas saying you were pleased with how the North Fields were performing and that I should continue as I saw fit. A pause. I thought the yield had improved because of the weather. The weather was adequate. Elizabeth held his gaze steadily. The yield improved because of the rotation correction. Jonathan put his face in his hands. Not dramatically. The way a man does it when something true has arrived and he needs a moment to hold the weight of it before he can look up again. Charlotte rose from her chair. She crossed to the center of the room and stood in the space between Jonathan and Elizabeth. Not as an adversary, not as an ally to either of them, but as a woman who had just understood that the situation she had entered was built on foundations she had never been shown. I want to ask you something directly, she said to Jonathan, and I would like you to answer me honestly. He looked up. Did you give me an accurate picture of your situation before asking me to be part of your plans? Jonathan held her gaze for a long moment. No, he said. Not completely. Charlotte was quiet. I believed what Hartley told me, Jonathan said. I believed the estate was stable. I believed... He stopped. I didn't read the reports carefully enough to know what I didn't know. Charlotte turned and looked at Elizabeth. There was no apology in Charlotte Ashford's face. There didn't need to be. What was there was something more honest than apology, the clear-eyed recognition of a woman who has been handed a fiction and is only now discovering it is one. Mrs. Mercer, Charlotte said quietly. I did not know. I believe you, Elizabeth said. They looked at each other for a moment, two women in a room that a man had arranged without fully understanding the people he had placed in it. Then, Charlotte picked up her gloves from the side table. Her movements were composed and deliberate. I'll send for my carriage. Jonathan moved toward her. Charlotte, I need time to think. She looked at him steadily without cruelty and without warmth. You should use the time to read that ledger. She walked out. The library door closed behind her. The fire continued to burn. The divorce papers sat on the desk. The pen was still uncapped. Jonathan stood in the center of the room for a long moment. Then he walked to the desk and sat down in the chair that faced the ledger. He did not reach for the divorce papers. He pulled the ledger toward him. Show me, he said. Elizabeth sat down across from him. She opened to the beginning and began. She told him about the kitchen accounts. First, the 15% overrun she had found in the first weeks of their marriage, and the ghost positions Crawford had been maintaining to collect the associated wages. She told him about Crawford, whose dismissal she had managed while Jonathan was in Richmond in April of 1811, and about Gerald Marsh, who had replaced him and been accurate and reliable in every quarter since. Jonathan listened, not with the partial, half-present attention she had learned to work around over 6 years of marriage. He listened the way a man listens when the ground has shifted beneath him and he understands for the first time that he does not know where the solid footing is, and the only person who can show him is the woman across the desk. "Crawford," he said. "I liked Crawford." "I know you did." "He'd been with the estate since my father's time." "Yes." He had also been collecting wages for a coachman who left in 1808 and a laundry worker who died the previous winter. The positions remained on the books. The funds went to Crawford. She turned a page. Over 3 years that represented a meaningful theft. Jonathan was quiet. "You never told me you dismissed him." "I sent a letter." "I don't remember it." "It was in the April packet. You sent back word that you trusted my judgment in household matters." She looked at him directly. "Which is how most decisions on this estate have been managed for the past 6 years. You delegated. I managed. Neither of us ever sat down to discuss what managing actually entailed." That landed. She could see it land, not with defensiveness, not with the immediate pivot to counter-argument that she had learned to anticipate from him in earlier years. It landed, and he sat with it. "Keep going," he said. She kept going. The Northfield rotation. The mill contract with Thomas Greer. The 4 months of correspondence she had conducted to prevent the mill business from moving to Staunton. The letter-by-letter negotiation of a fee structure that had protected the estate's income for years afterward. Jonathan listened to all of it, and she watched his face move through surprise, and then a longer, more complicated reckoning. "Greer," he said. "I shook that man's hand when the renewal came through. I told him I was glad we'd found a way to continue the arrangement." "He was gracious," Elizabeth said. "He didn't correct you." "Did he know? Did he know it was you who had—" "He knew who wrote the letters." She held his gaze. "He is a practical man. He does business with this estate. He was not going to draw your attention to the fact that he'd been corresponding with your wife while you were unavailable." Jonathan's jaw worked. "I was unavailable," he said. The words were flat and honest. "Often. And you managed. There was no other option. The estate required management. I was here. I was capable." She folded her hands on the open ledger. "And no one was watching closely enough to tell me I shouldn't." Jonathan looked at the fire. When he turned back, something in his face had shifted, the last of the morning's confidence gone, entirely replaced by something more genuine and considerably less comfortable. "The wages you covered from your personal account," he said. $400. 412. Over 3 seasons. Yes. The workers never knew. No. As far as the workers are concerned, the estate paid them on time every quarter. They have families. They have their own debts. The last thing they needed was uncertainty about whether their wages were coming. She looked at him steadily. "I was not going to let them carry the consequences of an accounting failure they had no part in creating." Jonathan sat back in his chair. He looked at the woman across from him. The woman he had staged this room to dispense with, cleanly and efficiently. The woman he had been certain would accept the terms, because what else could she do? And he looked at her, the way you look at something you have been walking past for years, and are only now stopping to actually see. The silence stretched. Thomas appeared in the doorway, quiet and careful. "Fresh coffee, ma'am." "Please," Elizabeth said without looking away from Jonathan. Thomas set the tray and withdrew. Jonathan reached for his cup and then stopped. He looked at the divorce papers face up on the desk, the pen uncapped beside them. He turned them face down. Not decisively. Slowly. The way a person moves something they are not yet ready to decide about, but are no longer ready to act on. Elizabeth watched him do it. She did not smile this time. She simply noted it, the way she noted everything on this estate that mattered, and she reached for her coffee and let the morning continue at the pace it was going to go, regardless of anyone's plans for how it should have ended. "There's more," she said. "About Hartley, about the debt, about what your solicitor has not been telling you." Jonathan looked up. "Tell me," she told him. And Jonathan Mercer, the man who had walked into this library at 9:30 with divorce papers on a silver tray, and the confidence of someone who believed the outcome was already settled, sat across from his wife in the room he had staged for a quick, clean ending, and began for the first time in 6 years of marriage to actually listen. Outside the estate, moved through its morning on schedules he had never read, and arrangements he had never known existed, managed by people he had never properly seen, held together by the quiet, unacknowledged competence of the woman sitting 3 feet away from him. All of it running. All of it real. All of it hers in every way that had ever mattered. Thomas brought the coffee. He set the tray down on the side table with the particular quietness of a man who had worked in this house long enough to understand when a room required careful handling. He did not ask questions. He did not linger. He simply arranged the cups, confirmed that the cream was fresh, and withdrew with the kind of practiced invisibility that good household staff develop over years of service. Elizabeth was already seated when Jonathan returned from the window. He had stood there for a long moment, after she'd left, long enough that she'd had time to speak briefly with Thomas in the hallway, long enough that the fire had dropped another notch, and then he'd come back to the desk and sat down across from her without the divorce papers in front of him, and with the ledger open between them instead. That was the first real change. Small, but real. Start from the beginning. Elizabeth turned to the first page of the ledger. The entries dated back to the autumn of 1810, the first season of their marriage, when she had arrived at Mercer Estate as a new bride, and spent her first 3 weeks quietly walking the property, asking questions of the farmhands, reviewing the household accounts, and discovering with increasing concern that the numbers presented in the estate's official records did not match the reality she was seeing with her own eyes. She had not said anything then. She was 22 years old, newly married, and acutely aware that a wife who arrived in her husband's house and immediately began pointing out the failures in his management was unlikely to be received warmly. So she had started her own ledger instead. She had begun with small things. Correcting the kitchen accounts, which were running 15% over without any corresponding improvement in provisions. Reviewing the servant wage schedule and discovering that 2 positions were being paid for that no longer existed on the property. A coachman who had left in 1808 and a laundry worker who had died the previous winter. The money was going somewhere. She had found out where. Jonathan listened. He sat with his coffee cooling in front of him, and he listened in a way that he had never listened to her before, not with the polite, half-present attention of a man managing a conversation while thinking about his next appointment, but with the focused, slightly uncomfortable attention of someone who is learning something important and is not entirely pleased about the conditions under which the lesson is arriving. The coachman wages, he said. Those were still being paid, until I stopped them in March of 1811. Who was receiving the money? Your former estate manager, Mr. Crawford. He had kept the positions on the books after the individuals left, and had been collecting the difference quarterly. It was not a large sum individually, but over 3 years it represented a meaningful theft. She turned a page. I dismissed him in April of 1811 and hired Gerald Marsh to replace him. Mr. Marsh has been accurate and reliable in every quarter since. Jonathan rubbed the back of his neck. I liked Crawford. I know you did. You never told me you dismissed him. You were in Richmond when I made the decision. I sent a letter. He was quiet for a moment. I don't remember a letter about Crawford. It was with the April packet. You sent back word that you trusted my judgment in household matters. A brief pause. Which is how most of these situations were resolved. You delegated and I managed, and neither of us ever sat down to discuss what managing actually entailed. That landed exactly as it needed to. Jonathan picked up his coffee, looked at it, set it down again without drinking. Keep going, he said. She kept going. The next entry was from the summer of 1811, when the northern fields had produced their first disappointing yield. Elizabeth had noticed the problem in July, when the tenant farmers began arriving at the house with worried faces and numbers that didn't add up. She'd ridden out to the fields herself, which had raised some eyebrows among the farmhands, a woman on horseback asking questions about soil composition and drainage, and what she'd found was a crop rotation pattern that had not been updated in nearly a decade. The fields were exhausted. They had been planted with the same crops in the same rotation for so long that the soil had lost the nutrients necessary to support a strong yield. It wasn't drought, it wasn't weather. It was simple correctable depletion, the kind of problem that any estate manager paying attention should have flagged years before she arrived. Crawford hadn't flagged it, because Crawford had been too busy collecting wages for workers who no longer existed. "I brought in a consulting farmer from Albemarle County," Elizabeth continued. "A man named Samuel Bright. He assessed the fields in August and recommended a revised rotation over 3 seasons. The cost was $60 for the consultation and an additional $40 in adjusted seed purchase for the first year." Jonathan frowned. $100, which I authorized from the household discretionary account, because you were in London at the time and I could not wait for a response that would have taken 6 weeks to arrive. She met his eyes. The alternative was losing another full season of yield from those fields. The cost of that loss would have been considerably more than $100. Jonathan looked at the figure in the ledger. And it worked. The northern fields returned to full yield by the autumn of 1813. They have been consistently productive since. A pause. "You remarked on the good harvest that year. You credited the favorable weather." He had the decency to look uncomfortable. "The weather was favorable. The weather was adequate." Elizabeth allowed herself the precision of that distinction without turning it into an attack. The yield was the result of 2 years of corrected rotation. Jonathan was quiet for a moment. Outside, a horse moved across the gravel, probably one of the stable hands bringing the morning animals in from the paddock. Elizabeth knew that schedule too. She knew almost every schedule on this property. "What about the debt?" Jonathan asked. "The $28,000. This was the larger conversation. The one that required the most careful handling, because the debt had not accumulated through any single failure, but through a long pattern of decisions made without full information. Decisions made by Jonathan, some of them, and decisions made by Hartley, his solicitor, who had reasons of his own for keeping the estate's true financial picture obscured. Elizabeth turned to the section of the ledger she had prepared specifically for this moment. She had known for approximately 18 months that this conversation would eventually happen. She had not known when or under what circumstances. She had simply kept the records current and accurate and waited because she had learned that eventually reality asserts itself, regardless of how many half-read reports stand between a man and the truth. "The debt began accumulating in 1812, she said. There were 2 poor harvest seasons across the county which reduced income from tenant leases. That is not unusual or alarming on its own estates carry debt through lean years and recover in strong ones. The problem is that Hartley did not disclose the full extent of the shortfall in his reports to you." Jonathan's voice sharpened. "Why not?" "Because Hartley had borrowed against 2 of the estate's accounts without your authorization. Small amounts initially. The kind of amounts that could be smoothed over in quarterly reporting if the numbers were arranged correctly." She turned a page. "I discovered the first discrepancy in the autumn of 1813, when the mill contract renewal required me to review the estate's income statements for Thomas Greer. The figures Hartley had given you did not match the figures in the original contracts. The coffee was entirely cold now. Neither of them was drinking it." Jonathan leaned forward. "How much did he take?" "In total across 4 accounts over 3 years, approximately $4,200. Elizabeth's voice remained even. "The remaining debt is legitimate, the result of lean seasons and deferred maintenance and 2 significant property repairs that were necessary to keep the mill corridor functional. That debt is manageable with proper planning. The Hartley problem is separate and requires legal attention." Jonathan's hands had gone flat on the desk. This was new information. This was the kind of information that changed a man's understanding of his own situation in a way that could not be undone. "You've known about Hartley for 18 months. "Yes." "And you said nothing." The question contained something complicated, not quite anger, not quite accusation, but a kind of reckoning with the fact that the woman across from him had been holding a significant secret for a significant amount of time. Elizabeth answered it directly. "I said nothing because every avenue I had for bringing it to your attention required you to be present long enough to receive the information." She did not look away from him. "In January of 1814, I put a letter in your morning packet specifically outlining my concerns about the account discrepancies. You were preparing for the Ashford house party. You sent word through Thomas that financial matters could wait until you returned from Fredericksburg. A pause. You were gone for 6 weeks. Jonathan said nothing. In April of that year, I requested a meeting directly. She kept her voice factual. You granted me 20 minutes. I used 12 of them to outline the account problem. You told me that Hartley had been managing your family's finances since your father's time, and that you were confident the matter could be explained. You sent for Hartley that afternoon. I remember that meeting. Hartley explained the discrepancy as a bookkeeping transition issue. He said the accounts had been restructured and the figures would align in the following quarter. She opened to the relevant page. Here are the figures from the following quarter. They do not align. Jonathan looked at the numbers. His expression had moved through several phases in the past hour, from confidence to confusion to discomfort to something approaching genuine reckoning. He was not a stupid man. He was a man who had operated for years within a system that rewarded him for trusting other people's management without requiring him to verify it. That system had failed him quietly, steadily, and he had not noticed because the failure had been managed each time by the woman sitting across from him. You kept covering it, he said slowly. I kept the estate functioning, yes. With your own money. With what was available to me. My personal account, household discretionary funds, renegotiated contract terms that freed up operating capital. $400 from your personal account. 412. Jonathan was quiet for a long time. Elizabeth let the silence sit. She had learned not to fill silences that needed to breathe. This one needed to breathe. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed again. Quieter, more careful, the way a man speaks when he is choosing his words without the assistance of any performance or pretense. Why did you keep doing it? A pause. Why didn't you simply let it fail? It was a genuine question. She could hear that. He was not asking it rhetorically. He was sitting across a desk littered with evidence of her years of invisible labor, looking at a woman he had been preparing to discard that morning, and he genuinely could not understand why she had kept going. Elizabeth considered her answer. Because it's not only your estate, she said it plainly. Mary and Henry Caldwell have farmed the South Field for 11 years. Their youngest daughter started school last autumn, the school that operates on the estate grounds because I arranged for the teacher's accommodation 3 years ago. The Braddock family mended the fence on the north corridor every season because that fence access is what keeps their lease viable. She looked at Jonathan directly. You asked me to manage the household. But a household is not a set of rooms, it is a set of people. And the people attached to this estate have built their lives around its continuation. Jonathan said nothing. I could have let it fail, Elizabeth continued. There were moments when that felt like a very appealing option. Particularly in the seasons when I was doing the work of 3 people, while being treated as someone responsible for nothing more important than the dinner menu. She did not say it with bitterness. She said it the way a person states a fact that has long since been processed. But the Caldwells would not have recovered easily from losing their lease. The Braddocks have a son with a bad leg who cannot find work elsewhere. The mill workers have no savings. They live season to season on what the estate provides. She closed the ledger. I did not do it for you. I want to be honest about that. I did it because I was here and I was capable, and the alternative was allowing people who had done nothing wrong to lose everything, because the men responsible for their welfare were not paying attention. Jonathan Mercer put his face in his hands. Not dramatically, not performatively, the way a man does it when something has landed and he needs a moment to absorb the weight of it. After a moment, he straightened. Hartley, he said. I need to deal with Hartley. Yes, promptly, before he has opportunity to rearrange any more accounts. Can you document what you found? Everything with the original records. I already have. Elizabeth rose and went to the small cabinet again, this time withdrawing a second folder, thicker with letters and copied documents organized by date. I've been assembling this for 8 months. I was prepared to give it to you, regardless of how this morning ended. The estate needed someone with legal authority to act on it, and that is you. Jonathan took the folder. He opened it. Read the first 3 pages without speaking. Then he looked up at her with an expression that she had never seen on his face in 6 years of marriage. Not gratitude exactly. Something more uncomfortable than gratitude. Something that comes before gratitude, in the place where a person first has to acknowledge how wrong they have been. "I owe you a great deal," he said. Elizabeth's response was not gentle. "You owe your workers a great deal. You owe the families on this land a great deal." She let that settle. "What you owe me is simply honesty, which is something we should have been practicing for years and have not." Jonathan held the folder without speaking. From somewhere down the hall came the sound of a door, and then Margaret's voice. Elizabeth's maid apparently arrived for the morning, and then quiet again. The house was waking up around them. The normal rhythms of a normal day were starting on every floor, in every corridor, in the kitchen, and the stables and the grounds. All of it operating with the quiet regularity of a machine whose maintenance had never been acknowledged by its owner. Jonathan set the folder down. "The Ashford situation," he said carefully. Elizabeth waited. "I behaved poorly." His voice was flat, not evasive, simply direct in the way that men are direct when they have run out of better options. "I told Charlotte that the estate was stable, and the marriage was. I described it in terms that were not accurate. I made decisions about my future based on a version of my situation that I had not bothered to verify." "Yes." "She didn't know." "I believe her." Jonathan rubbed his jaw. "She's a good woman. I have no reason to doubt it. It wasn't calculated on her part. She was told certain things and she believed them." Elizabeth said nothing because she understood what he was doing, and she was not going to help him feel better about it at the expense of her own clarity. He was trying to redistribute responsibility. That was natural. She simply was not going to participate in the redistribution. Jonathan seemed to understand the silence. "I told her things that weren't true," he said more plainly. "And I was prepared to make decisions that would have harmed this estate and everyone on it, because I was too proud and too inattentive to understand what I actually had." He looked up. "That's the accurate version." "Yes," Elizabeth said quietly. "It is." Outside the window, the winter light had shifted thin and pale, but present the kind of January light that reminds Virginia that spring is theoretically possible, even when it feels impossibly far away. Elizabeth watched it for a moment. Then she turned back to her husband. "There are 3 immediate matters that require attention," she said. "Hartley. The northern field drainage, there's a section that will not make it through another wet spring without repair. And the Caldwell lease, which comes up for renewal in March and needs to be confirmed before Henry Caldwell starts looking at properties in Albemarle County." Jonathan blinked. "You want to continue? Somebody needs to manage this estate." Her voice was perfectly level. "If you are capable of being a partner in that management rather than an obstacle to it, then yes, I am willing to continue." The word partner was deliberate. She watched it land. Jonathan had never used that word in reference to her, had never, as far as she could recall, thought of their arrangement in those terms. Wife, household manager, social asset. These were the categories she had occupied. Not partner. He sat with the word for a moment. "I don't know how to do that," he admitted. "I don't know how to. I haven't been paying attention to any of it. I wouldn't know where to begin." "You begin by reading the rest of that ledger." Elizabeth sat back down across from him. "Every page, tonight. And tomorrow morning you come to me with questions, specific questions, and I will answer them. And Hartley, send for your attorney in Richmond today. Not Hartley's recommendation, your independent attorney, Mr. Langford. Tell him what you found and give him the folder. He will advise you on the legal steps." Jonathan nodded slowly. "And the Caldwell lease?" "I'll draft the renewal terms this week. If you review them and approve, we can have the papers to Henry Caldwell before February." There was a pause, a long one. Jonathan looked at the desk, the turned-over divorce papers, the ledger, the folder, the cold coffee. He looked at all of it, and then he looked at Elizabeth with the particular careful attention of a man who is trying to really see something for the first time after years of looking past it. "I have a question," he said. She waited. "When you came into this room this morning, when you saw the papers and Charlotte and all of it, you smiled." He said it carefully, like a man choosing his footing on uneven ground. "How did you do that? How were you not?" He stopped, started again. "How were you not devastated?" Elizabeth was quiet for a moment, because this was not a question about the estate. This was not a question about ledgers or contracts or drainage problems. This was the first genuinely personal question he had asked her in longer than she could immediately remember. "Because I had already survived the worst version," she said finally. "The worst version was every morning I woke up in this house, knowing that the work I did was holding something together that no one around me saw. That version lasted 6 years. She looked at him evenly. "Walking into a room where someone finally had to acknowledge what I had been doing all along, that was not the worst moment. That was in some ways the first honest one." Jonathan sat with that. Then quietly, "I'm sorry, Elizabeth." She did not rush to accept the apology. Not because she didn't believe it was genuine, she thought looking at him now that it probably was, but because an apology delivered in the morning after a man attempts to end your marriage and discovers he cannot afford to, is a complicated thing, and she was not going to treat it as simple. "Actions," she said, "not words. That's what matters going forward." Jonathan nodded. He pulled the ledger toward him and turned to page 1. Elizabeth poured herself a cup of coffee. It was cold, but she had managed this estate through worse inconveniences than cold coffee, and sat back while her husband began for the first time to really read the record of a place he owned but had never fully known. Outside the estate moved through its morning. Old Henry had finished the grain run and was moving on to the next task on a schedule Elizabeth had organized without being asked. The Caldwell children would be walking to the schoolhouse in an hour. The mill correspondence she'd drafted yesterday needed to go out with the afternoon post. There was a great deal of work still ahead. There always was. But for the first time in 6 years, Elizabeth Whitmore was not the only person in this house paying attention to what needed doing. That was not nothing. That was in fact the beginning of something, though she was careful not to let herself feel too certain about what exactly it would become. She had learned long ago that estates like marriages revealed their true condition slowly over seasons through the patient accumulation of small, honest actions. Jonathan turned to page 2 of the ledger. He read with his whole attention. Elizabeth let him. Jonathan read the ledger until midnight. Elizabeth knew this because she heard him. She had gone upstairs at her usual hour, 9 o'clock, the same time she had retired every night for 6 years, and she had lain awake in the dark, listening to the faint periodic sound of pages turning in the library below. Pages turning and stopping. Turning and stopping. Occasionally footsteps crossing to the cabinet where she kept the supporting correspondence, and then the sound of papers being unfolded and smoothed flat. I was reading everything, all of it. She did not sleep easily. Not because she was afraid of what he was finding. She knew every entry in that ledger better than she knew her own reflection. But because there is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes after the most significant conversation of your life, and it does not resolve quickly. It sits in the body like a stone, heavy and warm, and it takes time to soften. She thought about Charlotte Ashford driving away in her carriage, head up, gloves on. Whatever she was feeling kept completely interior. Elizabeth did not blame her. She did not even particularly dislike her. Charlotte Ashford had been handed a fiction and had believed it the way a person believes any story told convincingly enough by someone they trust. The real Charlotte had sustained that morning was not rivalry with Elizabeth. It was the discovery that the man she'd trusted had been constructing his future on foundations he'd never bothered to inspect. That was a painful lesson. Elizabeth had learned her own version of it gradually over years, which was perhaps the more bearable way to receive it. Charlotte had learned hers in a single morning. She hoped the woman was somewhere quiet with someone honest working through it at her own pace. By the time the library went silent, sometime past midnight, Elizabeth had made a decision. Not about forgiveness. That was not a decision for a single sleepless night. About what came next. About what the estate needed and what she was willing to give, and where precisely the line was between loyalty to a place and its people, and accepting less than she deserved from the man she had married. She had not yet determined where that line was, but she knew she would need to find it. Jonathan came to her sitting room the following morning at 7. She was already at her desk, writing the draft of the Caldwell lease renewal, when she heard the knock. She called him in without looking up and finished the sentence she was on before she set the pen down. He looked like a man who had not slept. He was carrying the ledger. He set it on the corner of her desk with the particular careful reverence of someone returning something valuable that does not belong to them. "I read it," he said. "All of it. Every page." Elizabeth waited. He pulled the chair from against the wall and sat down without being invited, which was itself a small thing. A change from the formal way he had always occupied her spaces, as though her sitting room were a room he was visiting rather than a room in his own house. "The wage theft was worse than I understood from what you told me yesterday." He looked at his hand. Crawford didn't just maintain ghost positions. He was inflating supplier invoices by 8 to 12% and pocketing the difference. "I found the original supplier receipts you'd kept behind the main entries." "Yes." "For how long?" "My best estimate is 4 years before I arrived, possibly longer." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "He's been gone 3 years." "He has. Does he know you have the records?" "He does not." A pause. Jonathan looked up. "When Langford comes my attorney, will you meet with him directly, present the evidence yourself?" This surprised her. Not entirely after the previous day's conversation, she had revised some of her assumptions about what he was capable of understanding. But asking her to meet directly with his attorney to present evidence herself, rather than hand the material to him and step back. That was a different kind of acknowledgement than anything that had come before. "Yes," Elizabeth said. "I'll meet with him." Jonathan nodded. Then, "There's something else." The shift in his voice told her this was not about Crawford or Hartley or the ledger. She set her pen down fully. "The Ashford family," he said carefully, "will have heard about yesterday. Charlotte would have told her mother by last night. Her mother will have told at least 2 other women before breakfast this morning." He looked at her directly. "By the end of the week, people will be talking." "People will always be talking," Elizabeth said. "That is not a new condition. What they say will depend in part on what we tell them." He was choosing his words with unusual care. "And I want to be honest with you about something. About the reason I was prepared to about why Charlotte." Elizabeth looked at him steadily. "You don't have to explain Charlotte." "I think I do." She waited. Jonathan Mercer was not a man who found honesty easy. She had known that from early in their marriage he was charming and capable in public settings, skilled at the surface performance of sincerity, but genuine disclosure had always cost him something. She could see it costing him now. "I felt invisible here." He said it quietly without drama. "Not I understand how that sounds given what you've just shown me. I am not comparing what I felt to what you experienced. I know those are not equivalent." A pause. "But I had become someone I didn't recognize. A man who signed papers he didn't read and traveled to avoid a house that felt managed without him in it. And instead of understanding what that meant, instead of seeing that the management was something to be grateful for, I looked for a way out." Elizabeth was quiet. "Charlotte represented something simple," he continued. "A future that felt like mine, that I had chosen, that I understood. With you, I realized yesterday that I had never understood anything." His voice roughed up at the edges. "That is my failure, not yours. But I want you to know what it was, so you don't spend another day thinking it had anything to do with your value." Elizabeth held the silence for a moment. "Jonathan." Her voice was even, not unkind. "The problem was never that I lacked value. The problem was that you lacked the habit of looking." He accepted that. Nodded once the way a man nods when something true has been said, and there is no useful response except to absorb it. "I'm going to start looking," he said. "Then we begin today." What began that day was nothing dramatic. No pronouncements. No renewed vows or formal declarations. Just Elizabeth Whitmore opening the estate's operational files on her desk, and Jonathan Mercer pulling his chair alongside hers and beginning slowly with frequent questions and occasional frustration and the particular humility of someone who does not know where to start to learn the thing he should have learned years ago. He did not pretend to understand things he didn't understand. That was perhaps the most significant change. He asked about the mill contract and sat quietly while she explained the fee structure. He asked about the drainage issue on the northern field and listened without interrupting while she described what the consulting farmer had recommended and why. He asked about Henry Caldwell not as an estate asset, but as a person, and Elizabeth found herself talking about the Caldwells in a way she had never had occasion to before, because no one in this house had ever asked. 3 hours into the morning, Thomas appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Langford has arrived, ma'am. He's been shown to the study." Jonathan looked at Elizabeth. "Together," he said. It was one word. It was also a decision. They walked to the study together, and when Langford, a small, precise man in his 50s, with the sharp eyes of someone who had spent decades reading contracts for concealed complications, looked up from his chair, his expression registered a brief, controlled surprise. He had expected presumably to meet with Jonathan alone and receive a situation to be managed. Instead, he found both Mercers standing in the doorway with a leather folder of documented evidence and a unified posture that suggested the situation had already been substantially managed by the woman on the left. Elizabeth placed the folder on the desk. "This documents a pattern of financial misconduct by two parties," she said without preamble. "Mr. Crawford, former estate manager, and Mr. Hartley, current solicitor. The supporting documents are organized chronologically and cross-referenced to the estate's official records, which I have also included." She took her seat without waiting to be offered one. "I am prepared to walk you through any portion of this material that requires clarification." Langford looked at Jonathan. Jonathan looked at Langford with the expression of a man who was done pretending to be the most informed person in rooms where he was not. "Mrs. Mercer assembled the evidence," Jonathan said simply. "I suggest you listen to her." Langford listened for 2 hours. He did not interrupt frequently. He asked careful questions and made precise notes and twice rose to examine a document more closely under the light. By the end of the second hour, his expression had settled into the particular focused seriousness of a man who understands that he is sitting with something significant. "The Hartley matter," he said finally, "requires immediate action. These accounts need to be frozen before he has opportunity to make further adjustments." "I assumed as much," Elizabeth said. "Which is why I suggest you send word to the Richmond Bank this afternoon, rather than tomorrow." Langford looked at her with the slightly startled attention of a man recalibrating his assessment of who exactly he was dealing with. "Yes," he said, "this afternoon." "Crawford is a separate issue," she continued. "The theft predates my records, so the documentation is less complete for the earliest years. However, what I have should be sufficient to demonstrate the pattern. Whether to pursue legal action against him directly or simply ensure the estate is made whole through other means is a decision for Mr. Mercer and yourself." Jonathan spoke from across the table. "What do you recommend?" She had not expected him to ask her directly in front of Langford. She answered without hesitation. "Legal action is expensive, slow, and draws public attention to the fact that this estate was inadequately supervised for a number of years. Recovery through quiet negotiation. Crawford is not a wealthy man. He would likely settle to avoid prosecution, is faster, less damaging to the estate's reputation, and ultimately more practical." Langford made a note. "I concur with that analysis." Jonathan nodded. "Then pursue that." By the time Langford left, it was past noon. The household had moved through the normal rhythms of a morning meals prepared, fires maintained the estate, turning on its regular schedule, and no one outside the library, and the study knew that anything significant had shifted. That was the thing about this kind of change. It didn't look like anything from the outside. It looked like two people sitting at a desk reviewing papers. What it was underneath was an entire 6-year structure being rebuilt on an honest foundation. Thomas brought lunch. Neither of them had asked for it. Margaret had apparently informed the kitchen that both the master and mistress were working through the morning and would want food brought to them, which was exactly the kind of small practical management that kept a household running, and which Elizabeth had trained Margaret to execute without needing to be asked. Jonathan looked at the tray and then at Elizabeth with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the look he got when he noticed something that had clearly always been happening and which he was only now registering. You didn't ask her to do that. No. She just knew. Margaret has been with me for 4 years. She knows how I work. Jonathan picked up his fork, set it down, looked at the tray again. How many people on this estate know how you work? Elizabeth thought about it honestly. Most of them, the ones who've been here more than a year. And how many of them know how I work? The question hung in the air with its own weight. Elizabeth answered it gently because there was no version of the honest answer that was comfortable, and she saw no reason to make it worse than it was. They know your schedule, she said. They know your preferences. They know how to avoid inconveniencing you. You'd a pause. That's not the same thing. Jonathan ate in silence for a moment. Then, I want to meet them. She looked up from her plate. The farmhands, the Caldwells, the mill workers. I want to actually know who works this land. He sounded uncomfortable with the admission, the way people sound when they are asking for something they feel they should have thought to want much earlier. Is there a right way to do that, without it being strange? Elizabeth considered. Henry Caldwell usually comes to the South Barn on Thursday mornings to check on the grain storage. You could be there. She thought for a moment. Not to inspect, just to be present. Ask him about the spring planting. Let him talk. What if I don't know what questions to ask? Then you listen. That's enough to start. Jonathan nodded slowly. Thursday. They ate. It was, Elizabeth thought, the most ordinary meal they had shared in perhaps 3 years. No performance. No careful social management. Just two people eating lunch in a house they both lived in, having said a number of true things to each other and finding cautiously that the ground had not given way. It was almost exactly the moment when the first knock came. Not a servant's knock that had a particular rhythm, modest and quick. This was heavier. A visitor's knock at the front door, followed by Thomas's footsteps, and then a brief exchange of voices that Elizabeth could not quite make out. Thomas appeared in the doorway. He had the expression of a man delivering news he would prefer not to deliver. Mr. Ashford is here, ma'am. Miss Ashford's father. A pause. Jonathan set down his fork. Elizabeth set down her fork. Show him to the parlor, Jonathan said. Thomas withdrew. Jonathan looked at Elizabeth. Will you? Yes. She rose before he finished the question. Robert Ashford was not a small man physically or in presence. He was 60 broad, with the weathered authority of someone who had spent his life making decisions that other people had to live with. He was standing when they entered, not seated, which was its own kind of statement, and his face carried an expression that sat precisely between controlled fury and a calculation of consequences. He looked at Elizabeth with something she had not expected. Respect, not warmth, not apology. But the deliberate assessing respect of a man who had been given a certain account of a situation and had just received a very different one from his daughter. Mrs. Mercer. He inclined his head. A real inclination, not a dismissive one. Mr. Ashford. Elizabeth remained standing. He turned to Jonathan. The temperature in the room dropped several degrees. My daughter came home last night, Robert Ashford said, and told me a number of things that I did not know. His voice was controlled and precise, and did not require volume to communicate its intensity. I would like to understand clearly and completely what occurred in this house yesterday morning. Jonathan did not look away. You deserve a full accounting. I understand that. What I deserve, Ashford said, is less important to me at this moment than what my daughter deserves. She trusted your representation of your situation. She acted in good faith on the basis of that representation. A pause. I would like to understand whether the picture you painted for her bore any resemblance to reality. Jonathan's voice was even. It did not. Not fully. The admission landed in the room with a weight that everyone present felt. Ashford turned to Elizabeth. Mrs. Mercer, Charlotte told me that you demonstrated considerable restraint in your handling of yesterday's meeting. I demonstrated accuracy, Elizabeth said. Whether that constitutes restraint depends on your perspective. Something moved across Ashford's face. Almost not quite a smile. the kind that emerges when a man encounters a formidable person and recognizes them as such. She also told me, Ashford continued, that she was not aware of the full state of this estate's finances before engaging in any arrangement with Mr. Mercer. I believe that to be true, Elizabeth said, and that you confirmed as much directly in her presence. Yes. Ashford turned back to Jonathan. When he spoke again, his voice was not softer, but it had changed direction from the controlled anger of a protective father to the colder, more deliberate register of a man discussing business consequences. My family's name has been attached, however briefly, to a situation that reflects poorly on your conduct and on your management of both this estate and your marriage. I am not primarily here to threaten you. I am here to be honest with you as a courtesy I am not certain you deserve, but which I am extending because your wife requested it. Jonathan looked at Elizabeth. Elizabeth had not requested this, but she did not contradict Ashford because she understood in the moment of hearing it why he had said it that way. He was giving Jonathan a frame that made acceptance of the conversation possible without complete humiliation. He was being, in his way, more generous than Jonathan had earned. What are your expectations? Jonathan asked carefully. My expectations for my daughter are that she will recover from this situation with her dignity intact and with no lasting damage to her social standing. Ashford's voice was flat. My expectation for you is that you will do nothing in correspondence and conversation or in any other capacity that undermines her reputation in this county. She made no error. You did. The accounting of responsibility should reflect that. I will not speak against Charlotte, Jonathan said, to anyone, on any occasion. Ashford studied him for a moment. I also expect, he continued, that the financial matters you concealed from her, matters which, had she known them, would certainly have affected her decisions, will be addressed with the seriousness they deserve. I have no interest in your estate's difficulty becoming a subject of county conversation. But I have considerable interest in ensuring that my daughter's name is not associated with a man who cannot manage his own affairs honestly. I have engaged my attorney, Jonathan said. Today, the financial irregularities are being addressed. By whom? By Mrs. Mercer. Jonathan said it without hesitation. She identified the problems, documented them, and presented them to Langford this morning. The estate's corrective actions are being guided by her analysis. Ashford looked at Elizabeth. This time the look was unambiguous. Then it appears, he said quietly, that your estate is in better hands than you have previously appreciated. Yes, Jonathan said, it is. Ashford stayed for another quarter hour. The conversation moved through practical matters, what would be said publicly, how the Ashford family would characterize Charlotte's absence from any social engagements in the coming weeks, what courtesies needed to be observed. It was the kind of conversation that happens in the aftermath of near disasters among people who have decided practically that management is more valuable than drama. When he left, the house felt larger, not empty, just expanded the way a room feels after a difficult conversation has resolved into something workable. Thomas reappeared almost immediately because Thomas was nothing if not attuned to the rhythm of significant moments. Mrs. Whitmore is here, ma'am. Elizabeth's mother. She closed her eyes briefly. Dorothy Whitmore had driven 40 minutes from the family property in her carriage, which meant someone, probably Margaret, who had a warm relationship with Dorothy's housekeeper, had sent word the previous evening. Dorothy was not a woman who received news involving her daughter and sat quietly with it until a convenient time. Jonathan looked at Elizabeth. Your mother? Yes. Is there anything I should... Let me speak with her first. Dorothy Whitmore was 63 years old and had the particular immovable confidence of a woman who had managed a large property through her husband's long illness, through his death, and through 20 subsequent years of widowhood, without once allowing anyone to mistake her for someone who could be managed in return. She was seated in the parlor when Elizabeth entered, her back straight, her gloves in her lap, her expression reading with the focused precision of a woman who had already composed several responses and was waiting to select the appropriate one based on incoming information. She looked at Elizabeth for a long moment. Then she said, "Are you all right? Not what happened. Not what did you do. Not even what is Jonathan going to do about this. Are you all right?" Elizabeth sat down across from her mother and found somewhat to her own surprise that her throat tightened. "Yes," she managed. "I think so. Charlotte Ashford's mother sent word this morning," Dorothy said with the tone of a woman who has received intelligence through channels and is now conducting her own verification. "Mrs. Ashford's account was somewhat chaotic. I wanted to hear yours," Elizabeth told her. All of it. Not the careful, managed version she had presented in the library. The version designed for maximum impact on someone who needed to be informed rather than comforted. The real version. The 6 years of quiet management. The ledger. The wages she had covered from her own account. The moment she had walked into the library and seen the silver tray. And the smile. Dorothy listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her. She sat with her hands folded over her gloves and her eyes on her daughter's face, and she listened to the whole thing. When Elizabeth finished, Dorothy was quiet for a moment. "The 3 words," she said finally. "You need me. Where did you find those?" Elizabeth thought about it. "I suppose I found them because they were true." Dorothy looked at her with an expression Elizabeth had seen perhaps a dozen times in her life, the particular look that meant her mother was feeling something large and was choosing how to carry it. "Your father used to say," Dorothy began slowly, "that the measure of a person is not what they accomplish when the world is watching. It's what they accomplish when no one is." She paused. "He meant it as a consolation, I think. Something to say when the credit doesn't come. But hearing what you've done in this house, Elizabeth, I think it's also a description." Elizabeth did not speak. "What happens now?" Dorothy asked. "We work." Elizabeth met her mother's eyes. "Jonathan is willing to learn. Whether he is capable of actually changing that is something only time will answer. But the estate is not in immediate danger. The workers are protected, and the financial misconduct is being addressed through legal channels." "And your marriage?" A pause. "My marriage," Elizabeth said carefully, "is something I am not ready to define today. I know what it has been. I don't yet know what it is becoming. I am not willing to make permanent decisions about impermanent situations." Dorothy nodded slowly. "That's sensible." "It doesn't feel sensible," Elizabeth admitted. "It feels very strange." Her mother reached across and took her hand. Just for a moment. The kind of gesture that doesn't require words because it is itself a complete communication. "Sensible things often feel that way," Dorothy said. "Especially the ones that matter." Jonathan appeared in the doorway. He had knocked softly on the open door and waited to be acknowledged before entering. Elizabeth noticed that. Dorothy noticed it too, though she said nothing. "Mrs. Whitmore." He inclined his head with a respect that was genuine and slightly nervous, the particular combination that appears when a man is trying to demonstrate changed behavior in front of someone who has clear reason to be skeptical of it. Dorothy looked at him with the measured assessment of a woman who has been managing people's behavior for 63 years and has very little patience for performances. "Mr. Mercer." Her voice was precisely courteous. "Nothing more. I would like to speak with you," Jonathan said. "If you're willing, I owe you a conversation about how I have managed or failed to manage your daughter's situation in this household." Dorothy looked at Elizabeth. Elizabeth gave her a look that said, "Your call." Dorothy turned back to Jonathan. "Sit down," she said. He sat. What followed was by any accounting one of the more uncomfortable hours of Jonathan Mercer's adult life. Dorothy Whitmore did not shout. She did not accuse dramatically. She simply asked questions, specific, precise, chronologically ordered questions, and waited for answers. And when the answers were insufficient, she asked follow-up questions until she had the full picture. She operated with the methodical thoroughness of someone conducting a legal examination, and Jonathan answered every question because there was no honorable alternative, and he seemed at this point to have arrived at the conclusion that honesty was the only viable currency he had left. Elizabeth sat beside her mother and said very little. She did not need to. By the time Dorothy was finished, Jonathan looked like a man who had been taken apart and laid out in pieces, not cruelly, but completely. He was pale. His hands were still. He had the expression of someone who has been required to see himself accurately for the first time and is working out what to do with the view. Dorothy rose. She straightened her gloves with the precise deliberateness of a woman making a closing statement through gesture alone. "Mr. Mercer." Her voice was even and clear. "My daughter has invested 6 years of exceptional care in this estate and in your welfare. She has done so with intelligence, loyalty, and a generosity that you have, until very recently, entirely failed to recognize." A pause. "I am not in the habit of telling a man how to conduct his marriage. But I will tell you this. You have been given an honest accounting of your situation by my daughter, by your own ledger, by facts you can no longer avoid, and you have an opportunity now that very few men in your position are granted." Jonathan met her eyes. "Do not waste it," Dorothy said simply. She turned to Elizabeth and embraced her once firmly. Briefly, the embrace of a woman who wants her daughter to know she is seen and supported without making a production of either. Then she walked out. The house held the silence she left behind for a long moment. Jonathan looked at Elizabeth. Elizabeth looked at her husband. This man she had married at 22 and managed alongside for 6 years, and nearly lost that morning, and was now sitting across from in the early dark of a January afternoon, with their entire future arranged between them like the pages of an open ledger, and she made her decision. Not about love. Not yet. Those conversations would come later, or they wouldn't, and she was not going to force that particular calendar. About the work. About the estate. About what was worth protecting, and how. "Thursday morning," she said. "The South Barn. Henry Caldwell." Jonathan straightened. "I'll be there." "Good." She rose. "I have correspondence to finish, and you have a letter to write to Langford confirming this afternoon's instructions." "I'll write it tonight." She was almost to the door when he spoke again. "Elizabeth." She paused. "Thank you." His voice was quiet, not performed. "Not for today, for all of it, for the ledger, for the workers, for holding this together when I was too foolish to understand it needed holding." Elizabeth stood with her hand on the doorframe. She thought of all the mornings, the early light through the east window, the correspondence, the quiet decisions made without acknowledgement in rooms where no one was watching. "Don't thank me," she said. "Learn from it." She went back to her desk. Outside, the estate moved toward evening under a cold Virginia sky, the tenant families ending their day's work, the South Barn settling into quiet. Old Henry, walking home on the road, he had walked for 11 years without anyone at the main house really seeing him do it. All of it still running, all of it still real, and for the first time, not entirely alone. Thursday came with cold air and the particular stillness of a Virginia morning that has not yet decided what kind of day it intends to be. Elizabeth was awake before 5. She always was. She reviewed the Caldwell lease draft at her desk by candlelight, made 2 small corrections to the payment schedule, and set it aside for later. Then she wrote a short letter to Langford confirming that the bank documents he required were ready for collection. Then she reviewed the week's grain inventory, which old Henry had left on the kitchen table the previous evening, per their standing arrangement. She was on her second cup of coffee when she heard Jonathan's footsteps on the stairs. Not his usual hour. Not by 2 hours. She did not say anything when he appeared in the kitchen doorway. She simply looked at him, coat already on, boots already laced, and then she looked at the clock on the mantel. 5:30. He had set an alarm. Or he simply hadn't slept enough to require one. "Henry doesn't arrive at the South Barn until 7, she said. "I know." Jonathan moved toward the coffee. "I wanted to walk the north field first." Elizabeth set down her cup. "Alone. Unless you'd like to come." She had walked that field dozens of times. She knew every drainage problem, every fence line, every section where the soil composition changed and the crop rotation needed adjustment. She had walked it in mud and in frost, and in the full heat of a Virginia August, usually alone, usually at a pace that allowed her to think. She had never walked it with her husband. "Give me 10 minutes, she said. They walked in the dark for a while, the two of them, with the estate's familiar geography unfolding around them. The south path, then the turn toward the northern boundary. The ground harder than it would be in 6 weeks when the frost began to relent. Jonathan did not fill the silence. That was new. He had always been a man who managed silence by talking through it the way people manage discomfort by moving. This morning he was simply present, looking at the land with the focused attention of someone trying to learn something rather than confirm what they already believed. At the northern boundary, he stopped. He looked at the drainage cut Elizabeth had commissioned 2 years ago, the shallow channel running along the field's lower edge that redirected water away from the crop rows during heavy rain. It was functional, practical, and entirely invisible to anyone who didn't know to look for it. "This isn't on any of the estate maps," he said. "No, I had it dug in the spring of 1813. It wasn't expensive enough to warrant a formal survey, and the maps were already outdated." Jonathan crouched, looked at the cut more closely. "Whose idea was it?" "Samuel Bright suggested it. I approved it." He was quiet for a moment. If this hadn't been dug, what would have happened? The lower rows would have flooded in 1813 and again in 1814. Both were wet springs. We would have lost 30 to 40% of the north yield in each of those years. Jonathan stood up slowly. He did not say anything immediately. He looked at the field in the early dark, the rows the drainage cut the fence line, and Elizabeth could see him doing something she had not witnessed from him before. He was adding it up. Not in a ledger sense, in a human sense. He was calculating for the first time the actual dimension of what had been quietly done around him for years. "How much would that loss have cost the estate?" he asked finally. "Combined approximately $8,000 in crop income and tenant lease revenue." Jonathan turned to look at her. $8,000, he repeated. "Yes." He turned back to the field. "And you just did it, without telling me." "I sent the summary in the April packet. It was 3 lines. You returned a note saying you were pleased with how the north fields were performing." Jonathan's exhale was visible in the cold air. "I thought the weather had improved." "The weather was the same." A pause. "The drainage was different." They stood there a moment longer. The estate was beginning to wake around them. Somewhere to the south, a horse was moving, and closer, by the sound of someone opening a barn door. The ordinary sounds of a working morning. Jonathan listened to them with the quality of attention he had not previously given them. "I owe these fields more than I thought," he said quietly. Elizabeth looked at him. "You owe the people who worked them more than you thought." He nodded. Once. The way he'd been nodding all week, not dismissively, but genuinely, the nod of a man taking things in and deciding what to do with them. They turned back toward the south barn. Henry Caldwell arrived at 7 minutes past 7, which was unusual. Henry was typically punctual to the point of precision. He came through the barn's side entrance in his heavy coat, moving with the careful economy of a man whose knees reminded him of every winter he'd lived through, and he stopped completely when he saw Jonathan Mercer standing beside the grain stacks. The look on Henry's face was complicated. Not fear, not resentment. Something more guarded than either, the expression of a man who has learned over decades of working other people's land to keep his actual feelings arranged behind a surface of respectful neutrality. "Mr. Mercer." A careful nod. "Henry." Jonathan's voice was different from how he usually addressed the estate workers, less proprietorial, more direct. "I've been looking at the grain storage reports Mrs. Mercer shared with me. I wanted to talk with you about the spring planting schedule." Henry looked briefly at Elizabeth. She gave him the smallest nod. "It's all right." Henry turned back to Jonathan. "What about it?" The south corner rose. "Mrs. Mercer's notes indicate the soil composition has been changing. She recommended an adjusted rotation, but she also noted that you've been farming that section for 11 years, and that your read on its condition is likely more current than any report." Henry Caldwell was 61 years old. He had been farming since he was 14. He had worked 3 different estates in Virginia, and he had never, not once in that time, had an owner ask him directly for his read on a field's condition. He looked at Jonathan Mercer with the assessing eyes of a man who knows the difference between a question asked for appearance and a question asked because someone actually wants the answer. He decided after a moment that this one was real. "South Corner's been tired for 2 seasons, Henry said, and his voice shifted just slightly. The neutrality, relaxing into something more direct. Mrs. Mercer's rotation adjustment helped. But there's a stretch along the eastern edge, maybe 40 feet, where the clay's sitting too high. Holds water in a wet spring. Been meaning to flag it." Jonathan looked at Elizabeth. "Is this in the reports?" "No," she said. "That's new information." Jonathan turned back to Henry. "What does it need?" Henry looked at him for a moment longer, still assessing, still careful. Then he described the problem with the compact, specific language of a man who has spent his life learning a particular patch of earth. He talked about drainage angle and clay depth, and what he'd seen in the wet spring of 1814 versus the drier conditions of 1815. Jonathan listened without interrupting, which Henry seemed to notice, because as the minutes passed, his language became less guarded and more detailed. Opening up the way a person opens up when they realize with some surprise that they are actually being heard. 40 minutes later, when Jonathan had asked his last question, and Henry had given his last answer, there was a moment of silence in the barn that felt different from the silence they'd arrived with. Henry looked at Jonathan with something that was not quite warmth, but was notably more human than the guarded neutrality of 7 o'clock. "Most owners," Henry said, "ask the land agent, not the farmer." Jonathan held his gaze. "I've been relying on the land agent's reports for 6 years. I reckon it's past time I heard from the farmer." The word reckon. Elizabeth noticed it. Jonathan was adjusting without trying to perform the adjustment, borrowing the plain direct language of the people he was talking to without condescension, because it was the honest register for the conversation they were having. Henry Caldwell nodded once. "Anything else, Mr. Mercer?" "Not today. But if you flag that eastern stretch before the spring thaw, I'd like to look at it with you." Henry looked at Elizabeth one more time. His expression had moved the rest of the way through the guardedness, gone, replaced by something that was almost, if she was reading it correctly, relief. "I'll flag it," Henry said. "Ma'am." He touched the brim of his hat to Elizabeth with the respect of 11 years of working alongside someone who had consistently treated him as someone worth respecting. Then he got to work. They walked back to the house in a different kind of silence. At the front steps, Jonathan paused. "He's been wanting to tell someone about that eastern section for a while, hasn't he?" "Probably 2 seasons, Elizabeth said. "He mentioned something adjacent to it in a conversation last spring, but he wouldn't put it in a formal report because he didn't think anyone would act on it." Jonathan was quiet. "How many other things are people on this estate not putting in formal reports?" She considered. "That's the right question." He looked at the house. "Then I have a lot of conversations to have." "Yes," Elizabeth said. "You do." What followed over the next 3 weeks was not a transformation. Transformations in Elizabeth's experience were a feature of romantic novels and Sunday sermons, sudden, dramatic, complete. What Jonathan Mercer underwent was something considerably less cinematic and considerably more real. The slow, effortful, frequently uncomfortable process of a man dismantling a set of habits he had never examined and trying to replace them with something better, while fully aware that everyone around him had good reason to reserve judgment on whether he'd succeed. He met with the mill workers on a Friday morning. He spent 2 hours with the Braddock family reviewing the North Corridor access arrangement that Elizabeth had negotiated 3 years ago. He sat with old Henry again on the following Thursday and walked the eastern section of the South Field with his own boots in the dirt, asking questions and listening to the answers. He was not good at it initially. He interrupted too often. He occasionally slipped into the proprietorial register, the voice of a man explaining things to people who had not asked for his explanation and had to correct himself, which Elizabeth could see cost him something each time. He asked questions that revealed how little he understood, which is a genuinely difficult thing for a proud man to do repeatedly in front of people who have spent years watching him from a careful distance. But he kept going. That was the thing Elizabeth found herself watching most carefully. Not the quality of any individual moment, but the consistency of the effort across days that offered no reward, no acknowledgement, no particular sign that anything was improving. He kept going anyway. The news about Hartley broke on a Wednesday morning in the second week of February. Langford had moved quickly. The bank accounts had been frozen within 48 hours of their first meeting, and the documentation Elizabeth had assembled proved sufficient for the Richmond attorney to initiate formal proceedings. Hartley had apparently attempted to access one of the frozen accounts 2 days after the freeze was in place, which had provided an additional useful piece of evidence and had considerably shortened the negotiation over what he was prepared to admit. Thomas brought the letter from Langford with the Morning Post, and Elizabeth read it at her desk before taking it to Jonathan. She found him in the study, not at his desk being attended to, but on his knees beside the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet, pulling out a stack of folders he had apparently been reviewing. She stood in the doorway for a moment. He looked up. "Langford," she said, and held out the letter. Jonathan took it. Read it standing because he didn't sit back down. His expression moved through several phases. A tightening around the jaw when he reached the section about what Hartley had admitted, a brief stillness when he encountered the dollar figure. $4,930, he said. More than my initial estimate. Elizabeth leaned against the doorframe. He'd made additional transfers in the autumn that I hadn't traced yet. Langford says he's agreed to full restitution to avoid prosecution. Yes. Which means the funds will be returned to the estate accounts over 18 months, not immediately, but reliably. Jonathan looked up from the letter. And Crawford. Langford's man made contact last week. Crawford has agreed to terms. Restitution over 2 years. He won't contest it. Jonathan folded the letter carefully. Held it. Between Crawford and Hartley, he said slowly. This estate has been losing money to theft since before you arrived. My best estimate is 8 years, possibly 9. And I never... He stopped. Looked at the filing cabinet drawer he'd been going through. I never read my own files. No. I signed things Hartley put in front of me. Yes, because I trusted him. His voice was flat with a particular kind of anger, the kind that is turned primarily inward. Because he was my father's man, and I assumed that meant he was reliable. Loyalty inherited is not the same as loyalty earned, Elizabeth said. That's a lesson you couldn't have known you needed until you needed it. Jonathan set the letter on the desk. You knew it. I came in without the inheritance, she said simply. I had no reason to trust anyone on the basis of prior relationship. I had to verify everything. He looked at her with the expression that had become familiar to her over these recent weeks, that specific uncomfortable recognition of a man who is understanding something about the person beside him that he should have understood years ago. Is there anything else? He asked. Anything you haven't told me yet that I should know? Elizabeth thought about it honestly. There is one matter, she said. Jonathan went very still. The schoolhouse. She watched his face. The teacher, Miss Wallace, her accommodation was arranged through a private agreement I made with the Caldwell family. I offered the use of the East Cottage on the estate grounds in exchange for reduced-rate schooling for estate children. The agreement is informal. It's not in any estate document. Jonathan blinked. There's a school. Has been for 3 years. 14 children. 11 of them from estate families. He stared at her. You built a school. I arranged a school. Miss Wallace built it in every meaningful sense. She's an exceptional teacher. Jonathan sat down. Not dramatically, just sat the way a man sits when his legs have decided the conversation has become too much to manage standing. 14 children, he said. Yes. For 3 years. Yes. And I have never... He stopped. A pause. Have I ever seen Miss Wallace? You passed her on the South Path last October. You nodded. She nodded. You continued walking. Jonathan put his hand over his mouth. Elizabeth watched him. I'd like to meet her, he said finally. Properly. I'll arrange it. He looked up. Elizabeth. She waited. How much of this estate exists that I have never actually seen? It was not a rhetorical question. He meant it literally, and she could see that he genuinely wanted the honest answer, even if the honest answer was difficult. She thought about it carefully. The physical land you know, she said. The visible structures, the fields, the barns. But the life of it, the relationships, the arrangements, the reasons, things work the way they work, most of that has been invisible to you. A pause. Not because it was hidden, because you weren't looking. Jonathan was quiet for a long moment. The letter from Langford sat on the desk between them. Outside somewhere on the estate grounds, a group of children were apparently having a morning recess. She could hear them faintly, the particular bright sound of children playing that carries further than any other sound in the cold air. Jonathan heard it too. She saw it happen the moment he connected that sound to the thing she had just told him. His head turned slightly toward the window, a silence that meant something. "They're loud," he said softly. "They usually are." "Is that—" "Yes." He sat with that for a moment. Then he stood up, squared his shoulders, picked up Langford's letter and set it in the correct file drawer with the focused deliberateness of a man making small, exact, intentional choices. "I'm going to write to Langford this afternoon," he said. "And then I would like if you're willing to have dinner together this evening. Not a formal dinner, just dinner. And I would like to hear about the school, about Miss Wallace, about all 14 children if you're willing to tell me." Elizabeth looked at him. She looked at this man who had walked the north field at 5:30 and crouched to examine a drainage cut and asked Henry Caldwell for his honest read on a tired soil section, and sat with the weight of his own failures without making them her responsibility to manage. "I'm willing," she said. The dinner was not elegant. Margaret had been given short notice and produced a good plain meal with the competent efficiency that characterized everything she did, and the dining room was set without ceremony. No extra candles, no formal arrangement. Just 2 people and 2 plates, and the particular quality of quiet that falls when a conversation is allowed to be honest. Elizabeth told him about the school. She told him about Miss Wallace, a young woman from Charlottesville, who had trained as a teacher and had no suitable position because the county's formal schools did not yet employ women in lead roles. She told him about the arrangement with the Caldwells, and how the first year had required considerable persuasion, because some of the estate families were skeptical that their children's education was something the estate would genuinely support, versus something offered and then quietly withdrawn. She told him about the first day, 14 children ranging from 5 to 12 sitting in the East Cottage in their good clothes with their hands folded, watching Miss Wallace, with the careful attention of children who understand they are receiving something valuable and are not yet certain they are allowed to have it. Jonathan listened. He asked questions. Good ones, not performative curiosity, but genuine interest, the kind that builds on previous answers and goes somewhere. By the end of dinner, the candles had burned down 2 inches, and Jonathan knew the names of all 14 children. He had asked for them specifically. Elizabeth had provided them, and he had written them in his small notebook, the one he had started carrying in his breast pocket the previous week, and which she had noticed he reached for regularly during estate conversations. She had not commented on the notebook. She was noting everything. The following morning brought a visitor she had not expected. Charlotte Ashford arrived alone without her mother's carriage, without the formal announcement of a social call, in a simple traveling dress, with a composed expression, and the posture of a woman who has made a decision and is prepared to stand by it, regardless of how it is received. Thomas showed her to the parlor. Elizabeth came down immediately before sending word to Jonathan, because she wanted to assess the situation herself. Charlotte rose when she entered. The 2 women looked at each other for a moment, with the particular directness of people who have no remaining illusion about each other, and must therefore deal in reality. "Mrs. Mercer," Charlotte's voice was steady, "I owe you a conversation I was not prepared to have the last time we were in the same room." Elizabeth gestured toward the chairs. "Sit down." They sat. Charlotte folded her hands in her lap, a controlled gesture, the kind that manages anxiety without revealing it to anyone who doesn't know what to look for. "My father spoke with me after his visit here," she began. "He told me what he'd observed. The meeting with you and Jonathan. Your handling of the situation." A pause. "He said, and I'm going to give you his exact words because I think they're accurate, that you are the most capable woman he has encountered in 20 years of Virginia business, and that Jonathan Mercer is fortunate beyond his understanding." Elizabeth said nothing. "I didn't come here to apologize for existing," Charlotte continued with the straightforward honesty of someone who has done a great deal of thinking. "I made choices based on the information I was given. The information was wrong. That is Jonathan's accountability, not mine, and I think we both understand that." A pause. "But I did come to say that I believe you deserve to know from me directly that I had no understanding of your actual position in this marriage or in this estate when I agreed to any arrangement with Jonathan. I know that, Elizabeth said. I want you to know it from me. Elizabeth looked at Charlotte. This woman who had unwittingly been placed in the middle of someone else's failure, and she felt with some surprise, not bitterness, but something closer to recognition. Two women who had both been operating on incomplete information provided by a man who had not bothered to ensure his picture of reality was accurate. What will you do? Elizabeth asked. Charlotte was quiet for a moment. I'm going to visit my aunt in Richmond for the spring. Get some distance from all of this. A brief pause. And then I'm going to figure out what I actually want, rather than what I agreed to want, based on someone else's version of the future. Elizabeth looked at her directly. That sounds right? Yes. Charlotte held her gaze. I think it does. There was a knock at the parlor door. Jonathan appeared. He had been told by Thomas apparently, and when he saw Charlotte, his expression moved through several things. Quickly. Surprise, responsibility. The particular careful attention of a man who understands. He caused damage and is not certain how to be in the same room with the evidence of it. Charlotte looked at him. Jonathan. Her voice was measured. Neither warm nor cold, the voice of a woman who has processed something and arrived on the other side of it with her dignity intact. I came to speak with Mrs. Mercer. I've done that. I don't think we need a longer conversation than this. Jonathan moved into the room anyway. He stood rather than sitting. Charlotte, I owe you an apology, she said calmly. Yes, you do. I'm prepared to accept a brief one. Jonathan looked at her steadily. I told you things that weren't accurate. I made plans that affected you without ensuring I understood my own situation. You acted in good faith on information I had no right to present with confidence. A pause. I'm sorry, genuinely. Charlotte nodded. Once. The nod of a woman who has decided acceptance is more useful than prolonged grievance. I accept that. The room held the three of them in its quiet for a moment. An unusual triangle. The arrangement of people who have been connected by a situation none of them would have chosen, and who are navigating the aftermath with varying degrees of grace. Charlotte rose. She looked at Elizabeth. Mrs. Mercer. Her voice had something in it now, not quite warmth, but the precursor of it, the careful reaching of one person toward another who has been unexpectedly honest in difficult circumstances. If you are ever in Richmond, I hope you will call on my aunt's house. Elizabeth rose as well. Thank you. Charlotte picked up her gloves. She left without looking back at Jonathan, not from cruelty, but from the practical self-preservation of someone who has decided what they are putting behind them. Thomas's footsteps followed her to the door. The carriage sounds faded down the drive. Jonathan stood in the middle of the parlor, looking at the empty doorway for a moment. Then he turned to Elizabeth. She's going to be all right, he said. It was not quite a question. Yes, Elizabeth said. She has good instincts and a strong father, and she knows her own mind. She'll be fine. Jonathan nodded. A pause. Elizabeth. His voice was careful again. The careful voice she was learning to read, the one that meant he was about to say something true rather than something managed. I need to tell you something that I have been working up to for 2 weeks and keep finding reasons to delay. She looked at him directly. Then stop delaying. He looked at the floor briefly, then back up. When I arranged that library, the fire, the papers, the all of it. He paused. I had convinced myself that I was doing something practical, something clean, that I was making a decision for my own future. He stopped. I think the truth I have been sitting with, is that I was running from a marriage that felt like it was happening without me. Not because you excluded me, because I excluded myself, and I didn't want to face that. Elizabeth stood very still. I had everything I needed, he continued. Right here, a partner who was extraordinary, an estate that was functioning far beyond what my management alone could have produced, a life that was genuinely good. He looked at her with the specific, uncomfortable honesty of a man who has been required to see something clearly. And I was so busy not noticing any of it that I nearly threw all of it away for a fiction I had constructed about a simpler future. The room was very quiet. Elizabeth held the silence for a long moment. Then carefully, "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because you told me actions, not words." He reached into his pocket and withdrew the small notebook, the one with the children's names in it. "And I am trying to show you who I am choosing to be. But I think you deserve to know what I understand now about what I almost did." A pause. "Not because it changes anything that happened, but because you have been completely honest with me, and you deserve the same in return." Elizabeth looked at the notebook in his hand. She thought about 6 years of early mornings. She thought about her mother's hand over hers, brief and firm. She thought about Henry Caldwell, opening up in the barn at 7 in the morning when he'd finally been asked the right question by the right person. She thought about the smile she'd worn when she walked into that library. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me." "That's all." "That's not small," she said. "Honesty from you is not a small thing. I'm not going to treat it as one." Jonathan held her gaze. Then he put the notebook back in his pocket, the one with 14 names in it, 14 children who had been going to school for 3 years on this estate, without the man who owned it knowing they existed. "I have a great deal of ground to make up," he said. "Yes," Elizabeth agreed. "You do." She moved toward the parlor door. "The lease renewal for the Caldwells," she said over her shoulder. "It needs your signature this week if Henry is to have it before March. I'll have it on the desk tomorrow morning." "I'll read it tonight," Jonathan said, "and sign it in the morning." "Good." She went back to work. He followed, not immediately, but within the hour. And when Thomas came to the study with the afternoon post, he found both of them at their respective work in the same room, in the quiet and focused way of two people who have finally honestly begun. The Caldwell lease was signed on a Tuesday morning. Henry Caldwell came to the house himself to collect it, which was not typical. Usually, the estate manager handled document exchanges with the tenant farmers. But there was no estate manager at present, because Elizabeth had not yet hired a replacement for Gerald Marsh, who had retired in December, and Jonathan had asked her to hold the position open until they had agreed together on what qualities the new hire should carry. That conversation alone had taken 2 evenings and had been, in Elizabeth's quiet assessment, one of the more genuinely productive discussions they had managed in 7 years of marriage. Henry stood in the front hall with his hat in his hands and read the lease renewal from top to bottom before he signed his name to it. Elizabeth had always respected that about him. He never signed anything he hadn't read, which was a principle she wished more people in her life had operated by. When he finished reading, he looked up. Not at Jonathan, who was standing slightly to the left. At Elizabeth. "The eastern section," he said. "It's in here." "Page 3, Elizabeth confirmed. "The drainage repair is scheduled for the first week of April, before the spring thaw creates access problems. The materials have already been ordered." Henry looked at the page, found the clause, read it twice. Then he looked at Jonathan. Something passed between the two men. Not words, not a formal exchange, but the kind of recognition that happens when a person realizes they have been seen and taken seriously by someone from whom they had not expected it. Henry Caldwell extended his hand. Jonathan shook it. "Thank you, Mr. Mercer." "Thank Mrs. Mercer," Jonathan said. "She's the one who knew about the eastern section before I did." Henry looked at Elizabeth with an expression she had been receiving from the estate's working families with increasing frequency over the past several weeks. A warm, slightly surprised gratitude, as though people were still adjusting to the reality that their concerns had been recorded somewhere that mattered, and were now finding those concerns addressed in legal documents with signatures on them. "Ma'am." Henry's voice was quiet and direct. "The families on this land, we know what you've done. We've always known. We just didn't know if anyone else ever would." Elizabeth held his gaze. "They know now," she said. Henry put his hat back on, tucked the lease inside his coat, and left. Jonathan stood in the hall after the door closed and didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, "We've always known." "Yes," Elizabeth said. "They've been watching you work for years. People who depend on a place for their survival tend to pay close attention to who is actually keeping it alive." She moved toward the study. "It's the people insulated from the consequences who don't notice." Jonathan followed her without being asked. He had developed that habit over the past 3 weeks, following her movements through the house, not in a hovering way, but with the purposeful attention of a man who understood that the place where the real work happened was wherever Elizabeth happened to be, and that if he wanted to understand the estate, that was where he needed to be too. The morning post had arrived. Elizabeth sorted it at the desk. Correspondence from Langford, a letter from the mill in Charlottesville. 2 letters from neighboring estate owners that were almost certainly social in nature, and 1 envelope with handwriting she did not immediately recognize. She opened Langford's letter first. The first restitution payment from Hartley had been received. The amount matched the agreed schedule exactly, which Langford noted was either genuine compliance or a man demonstrating good faith in the early stages to establish a pattern before attempting to deviate from it. Either way, the funds were in the estate account. Jonathan read over her shoulder. She had stopped noticing when he did that, which itself was a notable shift from the careful separate domains they had occupied for most of their marriage. He paid promptly, Jonathan said. Langford will watch the next 2 payments carefully. The first is always prompt. Jonathan made a sound of agreement, low, thoughtful. He was learning to read legal correspondence with something approaching actual comprehension, which had required considerable adjustment in how Langford communicated with him. The attorney had adapted with impressive speed once he understood that his client now intended to understand what he was being told rather than simply acting on the summary. Elizabeth opened the unfamiliar letter. She read it standing up, which she sometimes did with correspondence she expected to be brief. She did not remain standing for long. She sat down. Jonathan noticed immediately. "What is it?" She read the letter through a second time before she answered. It was from a woman named Mrs. Genevieve Hartley, the solicitor's wife. The letter was 2 pages written in the careful, composed hand of someone who had spent considerable time deciding what to say and how to say it. It was not an apology on her husband's behalf. It was something more complicated than that. Mrs. Hartley wrote that she had been aware for several years that her husband's financial dealings with the Mercer estate were not entirely proper. She wrote that she had raised her concerns with him directly on multiple occasions and been told she did not understand the complexities of estate law. She wrote that when the legal proceedings had begun, she had gone through his personal papers and found documentation that she believed Mrs. Mercer should have. The documentation, she wrote, was enclosed. Elizabeth reached into the envelope and found 3 folded papers. She unfolded them. She read for 30 seconds. Then she set them on the desk with the particular careful stillness of someone managing a reaction. Jonathan picked them up. He read them. The color drained from his face in a way Elizabeth had not witnessed before. Not the pale discomfort of difficult information, but the specific colorlessness of genuine shock. His jaw tightened. His hands tightened. He set the papers down and picked them up again, as though a second reading might revise what the first had delivered. It did not. Hartley had not only been skimming estate funds for his own benefit. He had been for 3 years corresponding with a land speculator in Richmond named Gerald Voss, sharing internal estate information, including the boundaries of the Whitmore land agreements, the specific terms of the mill contract, and the location of the northern field drainage infrastructure, in exchange for a percentage of what Voss anticipated profiting from a land acquisition he had been planning. Voss had been attempting to position himself to purchase portions of the Mercer estate's adjacent land in the event that the estate became financially distressed enough to require a forced sale. He had been watching for the estate to fail, and Hartley had been quietly ensuring the conditions for that failure were maintained. Jonathan set the papers down for the second time. He wasn't just stealing. His voice was very quiet. He was trying to bring this estate down. Yes. While I was... He stopped, started again. While I was planning a divorce that would have removed the person keeping it viable. Yes. If you had signed those papers, the estate would have entered the next year with a dissolved land agreement, an undetected theft pattern, and a solicitor actively working against its interests. Elizabeth's voice was even, but not cold. The timeline Voss was operating on suggests he expected to be in a position to make an offer on the adjacent land within 18 months. Jonathan stood up. He walked to the window. Not the studied walk of a man composing himself for a performance, but the involuntary movement of someone who needs to put some distance between themselves and something difficult. "He used me," Jonathan said. "He used your inattention," Elizabeth said with the precision that the moment required. "Which is a different thing. You gave him the space because you were not paying attention. He chose to exploit it." Jonathan turned around. "That distinction is kinder than I deserve." "It's accurate, and accuracy matters more than kindness right now." He came back to the desk. He looked at the 3 papers from Mrs. Hartley. He looked at Langford's letter with the first restitution payment. He looked at the draft of the estate's spring operational plan that Elizabeth had been preparing, the one that now included the eastern section drainage repair and an expanded planting schedule and the schoolhouse maintenance that had never formally appeared in any estate document before now. He looked at all of it. "Langford needs these today," Elizabeth said. "The Voss situation changes the legal picture considerably. This is no longer just restitution for stolen funds. This is evidence of a coordinated effort to damage the estate's viability for financial gain. Langford may want to involve the Richmond court directly. I'll send for him this morning, and Mrs. Hartley deserves a response." Elizabeth folded the letter carefully. She took a significant step in sending these. Whatever her husband did, she chose honesty at some personal cost. Jonathan was looking at her with the expression she had come to recognize as his most genuine one. The look of a man who is being continually slightly surprised by the texture of the person he had spent 6 years not fully seeing. "You're going to write to her," he said. "Yes." "What will you say?" Elizabeth thought about it honestly. "I'll thank her for her courage, and I'll tell her that the estate intends to pursue the legal matter in a way that focuses on her husband's actions and not her family's welfare. I cannot make that guarantee from a legal standpoint, but I can make it from a human one." Jonathan was quiet for a moment. "You're protecting his family while he's being held accountable for trying to destroy ours. His children didn't choose his decisions," Elizabeth said simply. "And his wife chose to undo some of the damage he caused. Those things matter." Jonathan looked at the floor. When he looked back up, his voice was rougher at the edges than she had heard it. "I don't know if I would have thought of that," he said. "On my own. I don't know if the version of me from 2 months ago would have thought of that." "You're thinking of it now," Elizabeth said. "That's what matters." The letter to Langford went out that afternoon with a rider. The letter to Mrs. Hartley went out in the same post, written in Elizabeth's clear, precise hand. 3 careful paragraphs that said exactly what needed to be said and nothing extra. By the following week, Langford had responded with news that altered the legal proceedings considerably. Gerald Voss, upon being informed that documentary evidence of his correspondence with Hartley had come to light, had declined to wait for formal proceedings, and had instead made a direct approach to Jonathan through a mutual acquaintance, an approach that Jonathan had declined with a brevity that Elizabeth found satisfying when he relayed it to her. "He offered to purchase the adjacent land at market rate," Jonathan reported, "as though the previous 12 months of correspondence with my solicitor about using its potential failure for his advantage had simply not occurred." "What did you say?" "I told him that the Mercer estate was not in a position to consider any land transactions at this time, and that any future communications from his office should be directed to Langford." Elizabeth looked up from her correspondence. "That was exactly right." "I thought so." A pause. "I also told him that the drainage on the northern field had been repaired, and that we anticipated a strong spring yield." She looked at him more carefully. "You let him know the estate isn't struggling." "I let him know the estate is healthy." Jonathan's voice was quiet and precise. "I wanted him to understand that whatever window he thought he had identified, it's closed." Elizabeth held his gaze for a moment. It was, she thought, the first genuinely strategic thing she had heard him say about the estate's position in all the years she had known him. Not reactive. Not managed by someone else's agenda. His own read on a situation delivered with clarity and with purpose. "Good," she said. He smiled, briefly. The real kind, not performed, not managed, just a man registering something that felt like progress. She turned back to her correspondence. But she was smiling too slightly, in the way that people smile when they are not trying to. Spring arrived, the way it always did in Virginia, gradually, And then suddenly, the cold relenting by degrees. Until one morning, the world simply smelled different, and the ground gave differently underfoot, and the estate's rhythms shifted from the contained patience of winter to the purposeful energy of planting season. The eastern section drainage repair was completed in the first week of April, exactly as the Caldwell lease had specified. Jonathan was there when they finished, not supervising, just present standing with Henry Caldwell in the thin April sun, while the work crew cleared their tools, and Henry walked the section one final time, with the assessing eyes of a man confirming that something has been done correctly. Henry pressed his boot to the soil, watched the ground, nodded once. "That'll do," he said. Jonathan looked at the repaired section, the work done right, the problem addressed, the tenant farmer satisfied, and he felt something Elizabeth had been feeling for years and had never had occasion to describe because no one had ever asked. He felt responsible for it. Not in the abstract proprietorial sense of owning land, in the direct specific sense of having been part of solving a real problem for a real person. It was, he realized, a completely different feeling. He said as much to Elizabeth that evening. They had taken to sitting together after dinner, not always talking, sometimes simply occupying the same room with the comfortable quiet of two people who no longer required performance to be in each other's company. Elizabeth had a letter to draft. Jonathan had been reviewing the spring planting projections from the Northfield, cross-referencing them with the previous 3 years' figures in the way he had been learning to do slowly, without particular grace, but with genuine persistence. "It feels different," he said. "Knowing that the drainage is done, that it worked, that Henry walked it and said it would do." Elizabeth looked up from her letter. "Yes," she said, "it does. You felt that every time you fixed something on this estate. Every time. For 6 years. For 6 years." Jonathan looked at the planting projections in his hands. "How did you keep going without anyone acknowledging it?" It was a genuine question. She could hear that. Not rhetorical, not performative. A man genuinely trying to understand a stamina he found remarkable. Elizabeth thought about the honest answer. "Because the people on this land acknowledged it," she said finally. "Not in words. Henry Caldwell walks the Caldwell fields with the confidence of a man who knows his lease is sound. The Braddock son works the North Corridor without the anxiety that comes from not knowing if the access route will be renewed. Margaret manages this household without the particular strain of being asked to do more than the resources allow." She looked at Jonathan directly. "I did not need the house to acknowledge what I was doing. The house showed it every day in the way it functioned." Jonathan was very quiet. "I want to be part of that now," he said. "Not the acknowledgement, the functioning." "You're already starting to be." The spring yield report came in from Samuel Bright. Still, the estate's consulting farmer retained annually at Elizabeth's standing arrangement in the 3rd week of May. He delivered it in person, which he did every year because Elizabeth had found early in their working relationship that his verbal assessments contained nuances that his written reports sometimes compressed away. He sat across from both of them this time. That was new. Bright was 60, deliberate with the particular economy of language that comes from decades of working in conditions where precision matters. He looked at Jonathan with the same careful assessment Henry Caldwell had used in January, the read of a man determining how much he is genuinely being invited to say. Jonathan seemed to understand the look. "Tell me what the report doesn't say," he said. Bright looked at Elizabeth. She gave him the same small nod she had given Henry. "It's all right." Bright told them what the report didn't say. The Northfield was performing at its best since the rotation correction. The drainage repair had prevented exactly the water retention problem he had anticipated for that section, and the yield projection for summer was the strongest in 4 years. The south field was solid. The east pasture, which Elizabeth had flagged 2 seasons ago as potentially overgrazed, had recovered well following the stock adjustment she had arranged with the Braddock family. But there was a section of the property, the western slope bordering the Whitmore corridor, that Bright had been watching with concern for 18 months. The soil there was showing signs of a different kind of depletion. Not the exhaustion of overplanting, but something more structural. The result of water movement patterns that had shifted gradually after a rockfall on the upper western boundary 3 winters past. He hadn't mentioned it in the written reports because it was the kind of problem that required looking at, not reading about, and he had not been certain anyone at the estate was ready to look at it. Elizabeth set down her pen. How serious? Not critical, Bright said. Yet, if it's addressed in the next growing season, the western slope stays viable indefinitely. If it's left another 3 years, you're looking at significant remediation costs. Jonathan leaned forward. What does addressing it require? Bright described it, specific, practical, grounded in the physical reality of that particular slope on that particular piece of land. Jonathan asked questions. Good questions. Elizabeth noted specific building on what Bright said, demonstrating that he was tracking the actual complexity rather than waiting for a summary he could act on without fully understanding. Bright answered with increasing directness as the conversation progressed. The same opening up she had witnessed in Henry Caldwell and in every other person on the estate who had been asked real questions by someone who seemed genuinely interested in real answers. By the end of the meeting, they had a plan. It was not an expensive plan. It required some redirected labor, some adjusted planting in that section for one season, and one specific infrastructure modification that Bright detailed in a supplemental page he added to the report on the spot. When Bright left, Jonathan held the supplemental page for a moment. He had this ready, Jonathan said slowly. He already knew what needed doing. He's known for a year, Elizabeth said. He was waiting to be asked. Yes. Jonathan set the page down beside the main report. He looked at both documents, the information that had been requested and the information that had been waiting to be asked for. How many other people on this estate are holding a supplemental page? He asked. That, Elizabeth said, is the most important question you have asked since January. He looked at her. She looked back. Between them in that pause was the weight of everything. The 6 years, the ledger, the silver tray, the divorce papers. Nobody signed the small notebook in his pocket with 14 children's names in it. The Eastern drainage cut the Hartley restitution payments, arriving on schedule. The Voss window that had been closed, and the western slope that was now going to be addressed before it became a crisis. All of it. The whole accumulation of a marriage that had nearly ended, and then slowly, with considerable difficulty and no small amount of honesty, had begun. I'm going to spend the rest of this month, Jonathan said, having those conversations. Good. Will you come with me for some of them? Elizabeth considered. For some, she said. For others, you should go alone. The people on this estate need to know that you can be trusted independently. That changes if I'm always present. Jonathan nodded. He understood that. The fact that he understood it immediately, without requiring explanation, was itself a data point she was quietly recording. The summer moved the way good summers do on a working estate, with the purposeful, exhausting energy of people and land doing what they were built to do. The north yield came in strong, the strongest in 4 years. The Braddock family's son was given a permanent role on the maintenance crew. Jonathan had suggested it specifically after a conversation with William Braddock that he'd had alone early one July morning without telling Elizabeth beforehand. She'd found out from Thomas, who'd heard it from the Braddock family's eldest daughter, who'd come to the house with her mother to deliver a preserves basket, and had mentioned it with the particular brightness of someone sharing genuinely good news. Thomas had relayed this to Elizabeth with the expression of a man who had been managing this household for 11 years and was observing with professional satisfaction that it was changing in ways he approved of. Elizabeth had said nothing, but she had noted it. In August, Dorothy Whitmore came for a week's visit. She arrived on a Wednesday and spent the first afternoon doing what she always did, walking the property, asking questions of the people she encountered, forming her own independent assessment of conditions. She had done this every time she visited since Elizabeth's arrival, and she had always reported her observations directly to Elizabeth without diplomatic softening. On Thursday morning, she found Jonathan in the study, reviewing the Western Slope Remediation Progress Report that Bright had sent the previous week. She stood in the doorway long enough to observe that he was reading it, actually reading it with the focused attention of someone who understood what they were looking at. He looked up. Mrs. Whitmore. He rose. Please come in. Dorothy came in. She sat. She looked at the report on his desk. She looked at the notebook open beside it, the one with the children's names, which had expanded considerably since January, and now contained notes about individual families, their situations, their lease terms, the specific concerns each had raised in direct conversations with Jonathan over the past several months. She looked at the notebook for a long moment. "My daughter tells me very little about how things have changed here," Dorothy said. "She's not a woman who broadcasts what she observes. I come to see for myself." Jonathan met her eyes. "What do you see?" Dorothy was quiet for a moment. A man reading reports he previously left unread. Notebooks with names in them. A western slope that is being addressed before it becomes a disaster. She paused. "And an estate that is running with the same competence it has always had, but with somewhat better company at the top of it." Jonathan's expression did not change, but something in it shifted, the subtle shift of a person receiving a judgment they had not been certain they had earned. "I have a long way to go," he said. "Yes," Dorothy said plainly. "You do, but you have started, which is more than I expected in January." She folded her hands in her lap. "And you appear to have started honestly, which is more than most people manage." She rose. At the door she turned. "Mr. Mercer, my daughter loves this estate. She has loved it since she arrived. She will never say that in those terms, that is not how she speaks, but it is true." A pause. "Love something that she loves. That is my advice to you. Not because it is romantic, because it is the only thing that will actually work." She left him with that. He carried it. Elizabeth knew he had, because that evening he asked her for the first time directly and simply what the estate had meant to her when she first arrived. Not what she had done, not what problems she had solved, what it had meant. She told him. She told him about the morning she had first walked the North Field alone, 2 weeks into her marriage, before anyone knew her well enough to find it strange. She told him about the particular quality of the light that morning, and the way the land had felt genuinely alive under her boots. Not like a property, but like a place with its own character and its own concerns. She told him about the first time Henry Caldwell had trusted her enough to tell her something true, and about the morning she had found the school cottage standing empty and had understood immediately what it could become. Jonathan listened. He did not interrupt. He did not manage the conversation toward a point he wanted to make. He simply listened, the way he had learned to listen over these months, with his whole attention and without an agenda. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then, "You fell in love with it before you finished unpacking." "Yes," she said. "More or less. And I never knew." "You never asked." He accepted that, not with guilt. They had moved past the stage where guilt was useful, but with the simple, direct acceptance of a man who has learned to take honest information without deflecting it. "I'm asking now," he said. "I know." October brought the full accounting of the year's operations, the first complete seasonal review that both of them had participated in from beginning to end. Langford attended. Bright attended. Marcia's replacement, a young man named Foster, whom Elizabeth had hired in July after a 3-week trial period she had organized and managed independently, presented his first formal estate operations report. Jonathan read Foster's report before the meeting. He arrived with questions written in his notebook. When Foster finished his presentation, Jonathan asked them one by one specific and grounded the questions of a man who understood what he was reviewing well enough to know where the gaps were. Foster answered with the slightly startled confidence of a young man who had expected a perfunctory acknowledgement and was receiving instead a genuine engagement. Langford watched all of this with the focused attention of a man revising a professional assessment he had formed 8 months earlier. After the meeting, as the others were leaving, Langford paused beside Elizabeth near the study door. "Mrs. Mercer." His voice was low, professional, precise. "I have been practicing law in this county for 30 years. I have sat in a great many estate reviews." He paused. "This is the first one I have attended in which the landowner asked the questions and the advisor provided the answers. Usually, it is the reverse." Elizabeth looked at him. "He's learning," she said simply. "Yes." Langford inclined his head. "I see that. I thought you should know that others see it too." He left. Elizabeth stood in the doorway of the study and looked at her husband, at Jonathan Mercer, who had arrived in January carrying divorce papers on a silver tray, and had spent the months since learning the name of every child in the estate's schoolhouse and the condition of the eastern drainage cut, and the honest assessment of a consulting farmer who had been holding a supplemental page for a year and a half, waiting to be asked. And she made the decision she had been carrying since the morning of the silver tray. Not about the estate, about her marriage, about what she was willing to give it and what she needed from it, and whether she believed genuinely, not from obligation or pragmatism, but from evidence that it had become worth giving. She had spent 6 years doing invisible work. The work had always been worth doing because it was real, and because it mattered, and because the people whose lives depended on it deserved someone willing to do it. But she had spent those 6 years doing it alone. She was not alone anymore. That was not everything. It was not the complete resolution of 6 years of being unseen, unasked, unreckoned with. It was not an erasure of the morning in January when she had walked into a staged library and found a silver tray and a woman in blue silk and a pen waiting for her signature. It was something different. It was a beginning that had been earned through months of small, unglamorous, consistent honesty on both sides in different measures at different costs. She walked into the study. Jonathan looked up from the planting projections for the following spring, which he had been reviewing with the focused attention that had become his new habit, the one she had watched him build day by day in the spaces between the larger decisions. "There's something I want to say," Elizabeth said. He set the projections down. She sat down across from him, the same desk, the same chairs, the same positions they had occupied in January when she had laid the ledger beside the divorce papers and told him 3 words that were simply true. "I did not stay in this marriage in January because I wanted to," she said. "I stayed because the estate needed someone to stay, and I was that person, and I was not willing to let the families on this land bear the cost of a situation they had no part in creating." Jonathan held very still. "But I want you to know," she continued, "that what I have observed over these past 9 months, the notebook, the south barn, the schoolhouse visit, the Braddocks on the western slope, those things matter to me. Not because they prove you have changed, because they are evidence that you are choosing to." She met his eyes directly. "And I choose to be here," she said. "Not from obligation, not from practicality. I choose it." Jonathan looked at her for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was steady and clear in a way that she had not heard from him before. Not the managed clarity of a confident man, but the quieter, more durable clarity of a man who has been genuinely tested and has come through with something real on the other side. "I don't deserve that," he said. "Not yet. Maybe not for a long time." "No," she agreed. "But you're working toward it. And that is what I am choosing to believe in." He reached across the desk. Not for a ledger. Not for a document. Just his hand open on the desk between them. She looked at it for a moment. Then she placed her hand in his. The estate moved around them, the October evening, settling over the north field and the south barn and the east cottage, where Miss Wallace was almost certainly still at her desk, grading the week's lessons, and the western slope, where the remediation work was proceeding on schedule, and the Caldwell farm, where Henry was finishing his evening walk of the section he had worked for 11 years with the confidence of a man whose lease was sound. All of it alive. All of it held. By a woman who had chosen, when she didn't have to keep holding it. And by a man who had finally honestly learned why that was worth everything. The 3 words she had spoken in January had not been a threat. They had not even been a strategy. They had been the simple, plain, irreducible truth of a woman who knew her own worth before anyone else in that room had thought to look for it. And truth, unlike silver trays and staged libraries and signed papers, does not require anyone's permission to stand.